the Wade Center's podcast.
The podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This is Crystal Downing, and I am joined by my co-director at the Wade Center, David Downing, and our podcast producer, theologian Aaron Hill. And today we're following up our last conversations about Problem of Pain with C.S. Lewis's Grief Observed, which he wrote in 1961 after his beloved wife, Joy Davidman Lewis, had died from cancer. And I remember years ago hearing people say, oh, well, Grief Observed is where C.S. Lewis recognizes how deficient his problem of pain was, because here he finally goes through real pain and he understands that you can't philosophize or theologize grief. Now, what do you think of that, David?
Well, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings surrounding a Grief Observed. People sometimes ask me, is it true that Lewis lost his faith after his wife died? And that's way off track. We're going to have to talk more about nuances.
I feel like this is almost, in a way, one of his most controversial books.
Right.
People talk about it a lot.
Right. Well, it's he wrote it, actually, she died in July 1960, and he wrote it in 2 months after she died. And I would argue that was too hasty. He should have given himself more time in 2 months, you're not finished with the grieving process. Now, people, going back to Problem of Pain, people say, oh, that was the house of cards that collapsed that he talks about in Grief Observed. When he wrote Problem of Pain, his mother had died in childhood. He'd been almost suicidal with loneliness and isolation in boarding schools. He'd fought in the trenches of World War I and had PTSD the rest of his life. He had dreams about it. And then his father died. So the idea that he wrote Problem of Pain very naively, not having experienced pain, is inaccurate. But in many ways, people's perception of Grief Observed is inaccurate. In a way, there's a domino effect. They see the play Shadowlands, and Lewis comes across as a very abrasive, grieving person. He calls God a cosmic sadist, and when people try to comfort him, he puts them off. And at the end, you just see him crying with his stepson, who tends to represent Douglas Gresham. And that's actually a misreading. People in his actual life said he was very private about his grief. He didn't argue with people and storm about.
But that wouldn't be very dramatic in a movie, though, would it?
Well, that's true. But the trouble is people think movies convey reality. And so they get the wrong idea. As I say, when I speak, is it true he lost his faith? And I have to start with correcting Shadowlands. The cosmic sadist, it's very important to realize that phrase comes from the first third of A Grief Observed. A very important line in A Grief Observed is that sorrow is not a state, but a process. You don't need a map, but you need a history.
Well, in fact, I would say that then makes Grief Observed a strength that it was written soon after Joy died, because he's able to capture what a lot of people do feel after the beloved one dies. So they don't feel isolated and, oh, if I were a better Christian, I wouldn't be in such mourning. And so here is one of the most famous Christian apologists of the 20th century, and yet he experienced grief. But then as we read Grief Observed, we recognize this point that it is a process. And so he's acknowledging the devastation, but then also the recognition of how there is a slow transformation through it.
I was going to say, there are two things. He keeps giving the analogy of the rope, the rope catching him and whether you trust it. I feel like it's more of faith is more of a bungee rope. We tend to think of it as like, well, it either catches you and it arrests you completely, and you never go below that line of distrusting or questioning your faith in God. When in reality, I mean, the times when I've had these kinds of existential experiences in my life, you do start to have those thoughts, but your faith is what pulls you back. It what constantly tugs at you and goes, no, that can't be the case. No, there's got to be a better explanation for this. But it doesn't mean that you never have those thoughts or question them.
In fact, Lewis would confirm that. I love that image of a bungee cord that you
I do too. You've got a bestseller on your Faith is a bungee cord.
You go up and down in your feelings, and Lewis uses the image of a circle so that he thinks he's coming out of it in the process, but then he circles back into devastation.
But it's a spiral.
Yes,
and then he says,
spiral.
is the spiral carrying me up or is it carrying me down? I hope it's carrying me up. And he eventually arrives at that.
Can I jump in on that spiral image?
Yeah.
There's a subtext here that almost everybody misses unless you know Dante or know Lewis's interest in Dante.
Ooh.
In 1950, before he even met Joy, he wrote a series of sonnets called 5 Sonnets. And he says that every grieving person reenacts Dante's journey. They go down and down and down. They finally look into the face of Lucifer. And then they start climbing up and being purged and cleansed. And eventually they can recover this sense of glory.
Yeah.
So he had this image of grieving being Dante-esque before he even met Joy.
Yeah.
And when you read Grief Observed, it is very raw and very honest. And many of the phrases from the book are also in his letters, both the months before she died and the months after she died.
Yeah.
Interestingly, in the letters, he never vents. He never says to someone, my wife just died. God must be a sadist. My wife just died.
Yeah.
He always says, well, my faith is holding me up, or, in his will is our peace. So he was able to vent in the book under a pseudonym. This originally came out. He submitted it to Faber and Paver, which is T.S. Eliot's publisher.
Oh, okay.
And he wanted to call it By Domitius, One Divided in Half.
Uh-huh.
And Eliot said, I love the book, but you're going to create all this curiosity of who is this person.
Yeah.
Because I don't know anybody named Fred Domitius. So Lewis saw the point, and he came up with N.W. Clark, which is unknown scholar.
Yeah.
And then it was so convincing that when people knew that Lewis had lost Joy, and they sent him copies of Grief Observed. I think if you read this, it could really be comforting.
It's
very similar to what you're going through.
And why do you think he didn't want people to know that he was experiencing the grief like this?
Walter Hooper says that he didn't want to think it was just about his grief. He wanted it to be about everyone's grief.
Yeah.
If you just wrote, Joan Didion wrote a book called The Year of Living Magically. It was about her husband's death.
Uh-huh.
But to me, it was suffocatingly about her sorrow and her grieving.
Yeah.
And I think he wanted to widen his audience. Everybody can identify, everyone grieving can identify with this opening line, no one ever told me that grief feels so much like fear.
Yeah. Great opening line.
Yeah. You keep waiting for something to happen. And that comes right out of a letter. So that was part of it. I think I wanted to go back to the Dante-esque imagery. He also wanted to show a sense of recovery. Early in the book, he says she's like her mind was like a leopard. And in the opening of Inferno, Dante is chased by a leopard and a panther, and that's why he has to go underground. And then later he says she was like a sword, even though she was sharp.
Yeah.
She needed to be scoured and sharpened.
Yeah.
And that exact image Beatrice uses in the Purgatorio with Dante.
Oh.
He says, well, all these short swords need to be sharpened and scoured.
Yeah.
And these are actually, they're spaced out throughout this 50-page book or 60-page book. What is it?
Yeah, 60.
Yeah.
Later it says, well, I called her a sword, but actually she was more like a garden. She was more like a fragrant garden.
Yeah.
Which at the end of the Purgatorio, you get to the Garden of Earthly Delights. And then the very last line of the book, he says, she smiled, but not at me. And then he quotes an Italian Dante saying, and then she turned back toward the eternal fountain.
Yeah.
Right.
So she's becoming his Beatrice.
Right.
And I think in a way, he's writing within 2 months of her death, and he's being very honest and candid and even harrowing. But there is this underlying structure of going down to the depths. A month before he died in October 1963, he wrote to her and said, I'm sending you a copy of this book. It shows grief in all its sinfulness and folly, but finally he recovers in the end and his faith is restored. So he saw it as a journey through the grieving process back to the faith. I think we're going to talk about Letters to Malcolm in the next podcast.
Yes.
I think these two should be read together because I literally think this is Grief Observed Part 1 and Letters to Malcolm is Grief Observed Part 2.
Yeah.
He actually talks about, when I was in great trouble, you said my mind was going around in circles, which is exactly what we get here.
Yeah.
And he says, you wrote me a letter saying, I can't get through to you. I know you're living in this alternate reality and everything you seem cut off from everyone, which is the same point he made in Grief Observed.
Yeah.
So I almost wish they would publish them together and people could see the whole process from the time she died until the time he died.
Yeah.
Well, and to finish off your paradigm of the Dante quotations tying Grief Observed all together, the final line is the one you quoted. Then she turned back to the eternal fountain. And just in several years earlier, in 1955, he had read Dorothy Sayers' translation of Purgatorio, which is about going through these various rungs, heading like in a circle up and up towards paradise.
Well, it's literally a spiral. You spiral down to Satan, and then you
in
pass
the
Satan,
inferno.
and then you spiral
back up.
Right.
Yeah, so I think he's choosing his words carefully there. There's a literary subtext, which makes it not... a couple other things that Walter Hooper said about it. One was...
Maybe you should explain to our audiences who Walter Hooper is, just for review.
He was a fan of C.S. Lewis who went over in the summer of 1963 and became Lewis's secretary. Lewis was ill. He was going to die later in the year. And then he took over as literary executor. But he has a great fund of stories about that whole summer with Lewis and all the things he discovered in editing Lewis's papers. So Lewis gave him a copy of A Grief Observed and said, I want you to look at this. It's a fairly slim book. You can read it in one. And we sat there smoking a pipe while Walter read. And Walter got to the part about the cosmic sadist. And he says, oh, Mr. Lewis, you've lost your faith. And Lewis said, read on, read on. So he kept reading until he got later on in the book. And Hooper understood what he was trying to accomplish in this book.
And didn't Hooper think parts of this book were actually fictionalized, that this is not straight-on autobiography?
Well, that's another important question. He mentioned several times, I'm writing my thoughts in these composition notebooks, these old things I've had since childhood. And Hooper said, could I see the composition books that you wrote the original draft in? And Lewis went over dramatically and took a green composition book off the shelf, and it had some arithmetic and it had some drawings, but there was all these blank pages. There was nothing about A Grief Observed. And he said, that was just a fiction. I wanted to give this sense of this man who's just grabbing the first thing he can find to write on. It was also funny that we mentioned Letters to Malcolm, that when Hooper met him, he said, now, who is Malcolm?
Yeah, who's Malcolm, right?
It was Charles Williams? And Lewis says, oh, Walter, not you too. That was just a literary convention that he wanted to have a correspondent that he could, open his mind to.
Yeah.
Okay, so if this has certain fictionalized components, what about his gesture of referring to people as just by their initials?
Right.
So rather than Joy, it's H. And of course that goes along. Her real name was Helen Joy, right?
And who is C?
Yeah. Who is C? And there was someone else
BC or something.
BR is avoiding me.
R avoids him. He's talking to C several times. So who do people think C and R might be?
I think they're composites. I don't think he would be foolish enough to use someone's actual initial. If Tolkien's reading along and it says, well, JRRT is avoiding me, Tolkien go, hey, where do you, what's going on here?
Yeah.
So I doubt if any of them are the exact initials of someone he knew. By this time, sometimes he called Charles Williams C, but Charles had died by this time.
Dead.
In fact, he talks about that. He says, I had a friend who, after he died, had a very strong sense of his presence.
Right.
And that's a definite reference to the death of Charles Williams in 1945.
Well, David, I feel like people spend a lot of time debating over how much of this is actually Lewis, and they lose sight of the fact that Lewis had already grieved the loss of his mother at a very young age, and he had had a long time in retrospect to think about the grieving process that he went through, losing his mother, and then he just lost his father. When did his father pass away?
In 1929, shortly before Lewis himself returned to the faith.
Yeah, so he lost both of his parents,
Right.
and I'm sure he went through, a slightly different grieving process with his father, but it's not like he had never experienced the loss of someone close
Right.
to him.
Right.
And then
Right.
he had lost Charles Williams, and so it's not like he had never gone through this grieving process.
Not
I'm
to
sure-
mention his comrades on the front
Exactly.
in France.
Yeah,
Right,
the
right.
guys in the war. So the fact that to assume that he wasn't familiar with the grieving process, that he had never had any of these thoughts before, you almost feel like maybe he went through something like this when his mother passed away, and he did, for a time, lose his
but
faith.
When
And then
you're
he
9
recovered
years
it.
old, you have trouble even understanding what you're going through.
Yeah. But all that to say, he's had time to think about grief and the grieving process and observe it sort of externally. So as he's going through it, I get the sense that when I read this, that he has these moments where he experiences something, and then he has sort of a moment of lucidity, like in the book where he's like, he wakes up the next day and he was like, boy, I was really angry. I vented a lot, but now I can see things more clearly. And
Yeah, he says that wasn't really a thought. That was just a yell. I
Yeah.
was just letting God know what I thought of him.
yeah,
In one of his letters after Joy died, he wrote a letter of consolation to a friend who's lost his wife after many years of marriage. And he said, I suppose it must be harder to lose your wife after many years of marriage rather than my short marriage. For me, it was like not getting a piece of cake, but for you, it must be like not having bread. And that very analogy shows a certain distancing from his grieving experience over the loss of Joy to his friend's grieving experience. But I think he wanted it to be raw and to be bleak so that people could honestly say, I think it's okay to be this angry at God and to really just be flailing about. He was always very perceptive about his own consciousness. He was even in Screw Tape letters, people thought, oh, did you do a lot of study of moral philosophy? He said, no, I just looked into my own heart.
Yeah.
So one of the advantages of his style is that he's so perceptive about observing his own emotions and the ebb and flow of feelings.
This feels to me more like the book of Ecclesiastes, like it falls into the category of lament. And I think people struggle with it in the West because we don't. I mean, when was the last time somebody lamented in a church service? That's just something that we don't do. And we don't even really handle lament at funerals very well either. And nobody preaches sermons on the book of Ecclesiastes. You don't hear preachers get up there and say, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And so it feels very foreign to us. So when somebody starts to talk like that, we go, oh my gosh, they've lost their faith. They've gone off the reservation. They've gone crazy. But Lewis actually used the word vanity in here. And I wrote down at the bottom, vanity, vanity, all is vanity.
Yeah.
It just feels that's what he's doing in this book. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a whole genre of having a relationship with the Lord is venting and being honest and open with him. I mean, the book of Lamentations, the book of Job.
Yes. It's not a sign of lack of faith because the whole time, even when Lewis is mad at God, it's still affirming God's existence. And I think it is a cautionary tale to people who never have really gone through grief, who end up giving superficial Christian-y platitudes to someone who is going through grief. And if the great C.S. Lewis is just feeling such despair, how deficient those platitudes would be. It reminds me of a pastor we sat under in Pennsylvania who ended up himself dying of cancer, who told us how difficult it was for him when he was overseeing funeral services and then standing with the family, especially after the death of a child. So here are the parents at the funeral. Their 6-year-old child has just died, and people will go through the line and say, oh, God just needed another flower for his garden. And the pastor told us, I wanted to hit him in the nose.
Seriously.
It's just like, oh, don't be sad. God, she's a little flower in God's garden. And you read Grief Observed and you realize how that is just total insensitivity.
Yeah.
It is not an affirmation of Christianity. It's a deformation of Christianity.
Yeah. There's a number of those in this book when people say, oh, death doesn't matter. We'll all be reunited.
Oh,
Right.
And it is a cautionary tale about what not to say to a grieving person.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I like how he says we should all just be gathered together in settlements like lepers because people feel so awkward around a grieving person.
And he does talk about wanting to be around other people, but he doesn't want them to talk to him. He just wants them to kind of be there in the background so he doesn't feel lonely all the time.
Right. In fact, a friend of mine who recently lost her husband was commenting on the brilliance of one of Lewis's statements in A Grief Observed when he said that when he came across people, he didn't want them mentioning the loss of his loved one, but then he was also hurt if they didn't mention it.
Right.
So you feel both sides, that you are so tired of receiving this mournful sorrow from your friends.
Yeah.
You don't want to hear it anymore, but then you're hurt if they don't mention it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's two things that I wanted to get you guys to talk about from the book that stood out to me this last time. One of them is, he says in here, reality is iconoclastic. There's this theme throughout the book of the images that we create in our mind versus the real thing itself. And he does this especially with H, which refer to her as H and not Joy, but know that he's thinking. And he talks about how, he's worried that the real shape will be quite hidden in the end, the real person that he lost, his wife. But then he says, the rough, sharp, cleansing tang of otherness is gone. And he worries that he's just going to fall in love with the memory of her as opposed to the real thing, and that if she were there, she would sort of snatch the strings out of his hand and be immediately different. He gives this example of meeting a friend he hasn't seen in 10 years.
Right.
And he has this mental image of him. And then the guy shows up and he's different than the mental image. And then he starts to wonder, how did I forget all these things about him? And I had created this different version of him. And he shows up and he's suddenly like, oh, yeah, that's the real guy. So talk about that a little bit, about that idea of reality being iconoclastic and struggling with sort of false images. And then he obviously applies that also to God when he starts to talk about God. Thoughts on that?
It's too bad Jerry isn't here to join us because that's one of his favorite phrases from Lewis.
Oh, really?
That God is iconoclastic. We do build our idols. Iconoclastic is someone who breaks down the idols or the icons.
Mm-hmm.
And God constantly has to remind us, no, that's not me. Lewis liked this line from Charles Williams, this is thou, this is also not thou. And I can, even in the Bible, the ancient Jews are saying, well, he's our battle God. He's going, and then they lose the battle. And God has to say, no, I'm not really your battle God.
Yeah.
And then they say, oh, he's a God who wants us to go to the temple and worship and do all this. And God says, well, really, I want you to do justice and love mercy.
Yeah.
So even within and of course, Christ is extremely iconoclastic.
Yeah.
When the two brothers say, when you come into your throne, can we sit at the right hand? And that's not at all. They've been around him all day, every day, and they think at some point he's going to become this great, majestic king, and they'll get to be his courtiers or something. Lewis liked it because so often we put God in a box, and it takes experience to break that down. I remember meeting someone who said, "Well, God wants me to make $1 million and then give it all to Him." And
what?
Right. That was his idea. Was he was going to be very wealthy, but then he was going to be very generous with his wealth to the church. And he never did well in business. He always struggled. So for some reason, that God was a projection of his own optimal life plan. And God had to show him, no, I'm not really planning to make you into a wealthy person.
Well, I think what is happening with Lewis's statement about reality is iconoclastic, God is iconoclastic. And he essentially illustrates this with two powerful analogies. The idea of the insufficiency of language. You cannot capture in language an explanation for what God is doing, or you can't fully capture your grief. All you can do is come up with analogies. And the trouble is that too often people make language into icons or idols, I think would be a better term. because iconoclasm is about destroying icons that have become idols to you. And he gives the example of a communion wafer.
Yes.
And that is a very Protestant image.
I love that.
Where it is a sign
Yeah.
that Jesus Christ sacrificed his body for us. I am the bread of salvation.
Yeah.
And we consume that. But then many Christians turn the wafer itself into an idol that somehow the wafer has magical characteristics.
Yeah.
His other illustration of a type of idolatry of the memory of the person is his allusion to Queen Victoria.
Oh, yeah.
Who, when her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died at age 42, that is very young, she wore mourning clothes for the rest of her life, which was 40 years. So she was in mourning almost as long as he was alive. There are pictures of Queen Victoria where she's still wearing her mourning clothes, and she's pictured with her daughter, but she puts a bust of Albert on a pedestal next to her for the photograph, and she just turns and looks at him rather than at the camera. And Lewis alludes to this. She would lay out fresh clothes for him every day in his dressing room, fresh flowers, fresh water, as though she wanted to keep his memory alive. So she started idolizing his memory as though it were real.
That's like the incident that Lewis talks about of the old man who's lost his mother, and he starts to think when he goes to the grave and cleans it up and puts fresh flowers on it, he calls it Mum. I've got to go visit Mum now.
Right.
You talk about idolizing language. I was thinking of my own mother when we were growing up. There's a verse in the King James Bible where Jesus says, anyone who calls his brother a fool is in danger of hellfire, or some phrase like that. And my mom would never let us call each other fools. We could call each other idiots and morons and every other kind of insulting term.
The word fool was
but she never let us use the word fool. She felt like that particular word had a curse on it. And I think that would be an example of idolizing language in a particular way.
He comes to the end and he says, I need Christ, not something that resembles him. I want H, not something that is like her. And so he realizes that all the things that he's been clinging to, even his image of God, are not the real thing. And so he doesn't need to be afraid of losing those, because that was never the real thing to begin with. And he can trust that at some point in the future, when he goes and passes away, that false image will fade away and he'll see the real God. And so he has trust in that, not in the facsimile.
Yeah, false image is a really good term for it. In fact, David wrote a whole book on mysticism in C.S. Lewis. Were you partially inspired by Grief Observed for that? Because there is a little allusion to a mystical sense of Joy's presence, but he doesn't want to idolize it.
Well, he talks about a mystical sense of Charles Williams' presence after he passed, but he also says that Joy herself had kind of a mystical experience.
Right.
She felt that God was wanting to get her attention, and she was trying to ignore him because she didn't really want to obey or give up whatever it was that he. And then finally he says, "I want to give you a gift. I want to give you joy." Yeah, I did use those illustrations in my book on mysticism.
Yeah.
He was fascinated by any experience that goes beyond the rational, a sense of the presence of God in your life.
He does use the word union with God, the phrase union with God in the book.
Right.
I was also going to say he had a very good insight that I had not noticed in the previous times I had read this, where he's talking about marriage. He questions aloud whether bereavement is part of being in a marriage, just like a honeymoon is part of being in a marriage. And he talks about his marriage as ongoing. It's just that Joy is someplace else and they're separated
going
for
on.
a time. Yeah. But there's this sense in which, almost kind of like the Queen Victoria example, that's what made me think of it, is he talks in here about this sort of a new phase of his marriage, and he has to, but they've been separated. You know, he says, God looks at him and goes, okay, you go to the left and she goes to the right, and you're going to be separated. Mm-hmm. So that to me, that was an interesting insight in the book about it being a different phase of your marriage.
Right. Well, also that goes back to reinforcing his interest in purgatory. that he actually says anguish doesn't necessarily stop with death. He implies that joy, or H as he calls her in this book, is missing him in purgatory as well.
Yeah.
And
that she wasn't a perfect woman, and that he would have
right.
to perfect some things in her and make her that bright Jerusalem sword.
Right.
And again, unfortunately, Protestants have kind of a warped view of the doctrine of purgatory as though it's, you have to pay a price for all your sins. Yeah. And that is not how it was originally conceptualized. Yeah. It was conceptualized as, I am on my way to meeting my maker, the creator of the universe. Oh my goodness. I need to make myself presentable because I love him so much.
Yeah.
And the better analogy rather than a works orientation is and we may have talked about this earlier, a bride who spills grape juice or wine on her bride dress right before the marriage ceremony is going to go to great pains. And we say that she went to great pains to get rid of the stain because she wants to be beautiful for her bridegroom.
Yeah.
Well, the same for us. We won't go to great pains to be beautiful for our bridegroom, Jesus Christ. And that's a whole different way of thinking of purgatory in this process, and that there may be pains in purgatory.
Yeah.
Although Lewis said purgatory was edifying speculation, not doctrine.
Right, of course.
So he would never insist upon
But he
that.
does, of all the books where he talks about purgatory at the greatest length, is actually in the Letters to Malcolm, which is the follow-up to this. So
so we'll talk about
we
that
can talk
more
about
then.
That, next week. But it makes me think that it was something on his mind that he was thinking about. He was faced with the death of someone very close to him, whom he loved, but recognized that she was imperfect. And I think he began to think about his own death. You can see it crop up in his letters towards the end of his life when he talks about his diagnosis, and he's sort of preparing himself mentally and spiritually for death as well. And he starts to think about purgatory. So, it would make sense that here's this doctrine that you'd heard about, but maybe hadn't believed in personally, but you start to think about it and question it, just in the same way that my grandmother, when she knew that she was dying, started reading books about heaven. Because she's just, you're just trying to prepare for your next journey. Just like if you were going to travel somewhere on a vacation, you'd, start to read about the place that you were going to go to so you can enjoy it more when you get there.
Did they have the several stars to things in heaven? Did they have, like a travel guide?
Oh, 4 stars?
5 stars, yeah.
4 stars. Too many harps.
The buffet is wonderful, though, at the banqueting table. Well, Lewis's letters, as he approached his own death, are surprisingly cheerful. He talks to one woman and says, it's all fun, solemn fun, isn't it? And then in another letter, he says, I feel like a sprout that's been waiting to actually burst out into the air all my life, and my death will actually be springing up a new bud into above the earth.
The other thing that I wanted you guys to talk about, I mentioned the 2 things. The other thing was he keeps saying throughout the book this phrase, but the real question is. He keeps coming back to that. The real question is. And in one place he says, the real question is whether he, meaning God, is a vet or a vivisector. Sometimes he says, is he a cosmic sadist or is he a
vivisectionist?
A vivisection. And the question he keeps coming back to is, do I have the right image of God in my mind? At one point he says, I can't convince myself that God doesn't exist. The real question is, has the image of God that I've had in my head this whole time been false and he's something else, and I'm just going to have to come to terms with the fact that God is different than what I thought he was.
Right.
So talk about that for a second. It feels like that's a thing he circles in the book about this real question of God.
One image that he uses both in this book and in his letters is God as the dentist. In an earlier book, he says, you go to the dentist and you just want them to, take care of a little cavity. And next thing you know, they want drilling and they want extractions and root canals. And he says, people who say, I don't fear God because he's good. Have you never been to the dentist? So I think that image of someone who's good, and they're helping you, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be painful.
Yeah, or the surgeon, he's like, you wouldn't want the surgeon to stop in the middle of the procedure just because it hurts, because you want them to cut the thing out that's making you sick,
Right. I still remember the first time I confronted this idea. I was 17 years old, and got a job over the summer at a Christian conference ground where I worked in a bookstore, and the manager of the bookstore I got to know quite well because we had all these down hours sitting in the store waiting for people to come into the store. And she had gone through so much suffering in her life. And just year after year, losing loved ones and sickness and pain and accidents. And I finally said to her, this isn't fair how much suffering you've gone through. How does it make you feel about God? And she said, well, I love working in gardens, and I just know that some flowers to be beautiful need a lot more pruning than others. And for some reason, God knows I need to be pruned back in order to become what God intends for me. And I found that incredibly profound. Yeah. And
I'd say I prefer to be a weed.
Yeah. And Lewis is saying something similar.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to get you guys to react to is he talks a little bit about masculine and feminine traits when he starts talking about age. And I thought he had a good line in here. He says this idea that he says, it is arrogance in us to call frankness, fairness, and chivalry masculine when we see them in a woman. It is arrogance in them to describe a man's sensitiveness or tact or tenderness as feminine. He says marriage heals this false assumption that we have. Jointly, the two become fully human. In the image of God, he created them.
Right.
So there's this sense in which he realizes that in his marriage with H, or with Joy, there was something about the image of God in him that became more complete or more full when the two of them became one. What are your thoughts on that? And I thought that was an interesting deconstruction he has there of masculine and feminine traits.
Well, that's just another example of God being iconoclastic. And so Lewis is learning about the iconoclasm that we use certain words like masculine and feminine, and then we align them with these absolute categories.
Yeah.
And that limits human development by saying to a woman, oh, that's too masculine, or to a male, that's too feminine. And he is exposing that we are so beyond those cultural constructions of gender.
Yeah.
And he learned that through Sayers and Joy.
Yeah.
And I've said elsewhere, I think Sayers and her just pushing back against Lewis, challenging him about his own cultural constructions of gender, prepared him for Joy.
Yeah, he says in here, that's what I meant when I once praised her for her, quote, masculine virtues. But she soon put a stop to that by asking how I'd like to be praised for my feminine ones.
Right.
It was a good riposte, dear.
Right. The insufficiency of language and how certain terminology becomes absolutized. And that is the idolatry that Protestants often fall into.
Well, that's actually very evolved for Lewis. People think of him as a bachelor and a man's man. And that incident, actually, he mentions that in the letter.
Oh, really?
It's interesting that he's actually implying in the passage you read that a human being is not complete until you're in a marital relationship.
I was wondering if you guys are going to pick up on that.
Yeah, he would not have said that probably 20 years earlier.
Yeah.
And also, when we get the letters to Malcolm, Malcolm's wife chips in some ideas. So it's a three-way conversation, not a two-way conversation.
Yeah.
There's a good book called The Sword Between the Sexes by Mary Stuart Van Luen. And she got that phrase, a sword between the sexes, from the passage you just read.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That often males and females have trouble coming together in a union because of gender stereotypes.
Gotcha.
The image goes back to Norse mythology, where Siegfried, or one of these heroes, has to sleep in a bed with a woman, but he knows that nothing should be happening. So he takes a sharp sword and puts it between the two of them. So a sword between the sexes is something that separates or divides you.
Okay.
But going back to what Crystal said, I think he evolved his whole life from kind of a sexist view of women that you would get from growing up in boarding schools and being around Oxford, but then meeting Dorothy Sayers, Stella Aldwinkle, G.E.M. Anscombe, Ruth Pitter, Joy Davidman. A lot of times the best way to be iconoclastic is actually to meet people.
Exactly.
Yes.
You say,
I was
well,
going to
they're
say,
like this, you know.
Yeah. I think that's the best way to break down those illusions and those stereotypes is to actually meet someone in real life and you go, oh, they're not like that at all.
Right, right.
Yeah, and to answer your question about, is Lewis implying, well, you have to be married in order to be a complete human being? I think we could alleviate assumptions about that by his repeated reference to H, or Joy, about her otherness and being other.
Right.
And it reminds me of a philosopher who was contemporary with Lewis, Mikhail Bakhtin, who was in Russia, and when it came out, or in the Soviet Union at the time, when it came out that he was a Christian, meeting in 1929 with other Russian Christians, and of course they had to do it surreptitiously because the communist state outlawed such activities, he was sent to Siberia. And so he stood for his Christian faith, went to Siberia, and started writing philosophy, really, and you could say Bakhtin was someone exploring how reality is iconoclastic because he was analyzing language and how we start making idols of words. But one of his important points he calls consummation. And of course, we associate consummation with sexual fulfillment in a marriage. Did you consummate the marriage? And he said, consummation is an establishment of our identity by the other. You never fully know yourself until you're in relationship with the other. Now, it doesn't mean you have to marry the other, but if you listen to the other and how they see you and respond to you, and of course, will be consummated by differently by different people. So my students see me differently than my husband sees me, than my mother sees me, than my best friend. So they're all consummating me, but I have to listen to that. The other is essential to the self. And of course, this is reinforced by Christian doctrine that even God is inherently other. God is three in one.
Yeah.
God is continually in this process of consummation, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, in this radical otherness that is part of the identity. And Bakhtin calls it participatory outsideness.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that that's what he's getting at. It's not mystifying marriage. It is the idea of consummation. We need the other to know the self.
Yeah.
And I think for Lewis, that's part of his grieving, is that Joy Davidman, this wife, helped him see himself in a radically new way. She was part of the iconoclasm even of his self-image.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we struggle with that idea of marriage being the completion. You know, you have to be in a marriage in order to image God. Only if we think that in an individual, you by yourself are the image of God, that there's no need for you to be in a community. There's no need to be part of a church. There's no need to be. So it's this very isolated, sort of solipsistic view of reality that, like, I by myself image God. I don't need anyone else, sort of man is an island, as opposed to a more relational picture where in order for me to image God fully, I need to be in a relationship with others. And in a sense, a marriage could be a core relationship, but it also could be a family with children. It could be, your church family. It could be a community. It doesn't necessarily have to be in a marriage.
Yeah, it goes back to the four loves. Love intrinsically completes you. So whether it's friendship or family affection or romance, and obviously loving God and be loved by God is the ultimate completion of our human nature.
Right. Even the word communication, community, communion, that the root M-U-N means gift.
Yeah.
So that is what Bakhtin is talking about, is our sense of self is a gift from the other.
Yeah. So, a grief observed. I thought it was interesting. In my book, I have a foreword by Douglas Gresham where he points out that this is a grief observed. It's not his observations on grief in general. So it's a very specific thing.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, we're going to follow it up next week or 2 weeks from now with our discussion on Letters to Malcolm. But what would your advice be to people? How should people use this? This book feels very much like it's a tool. A lot of his other books are something to experience. You read the Chronicles of Narnia and you can get all kinds of things out of it. But this one feels like it has a use to it. How do you think people should use this book or approach it, or when is a good time to read it, or should you only read it after you've lost someone? What are your thoughts on sort of the usefulness of this book and its application?
Well, my mother first read it. She said she found it was candid but not comforting. He doesn't try to say, well, you'll be reunited on the other side. I would say read it with discretion. In some ways, he is talking about his mental processes. At one point, he says, I guess there's nothing to do with suffering but to suffer it. You can't think your way out of it.
Yeah.
He actually says reading isn't not enough of a drug, so I'm trying to write therapeutically about this process. I think that is him. If I had this level of bereavement, I don't think I would want to journal about it. I would think that would take me even further into a downward spiral. So I would say take what works for you. Do read it in the context of Letters to Malcolm. You see the grieving process mellowing out even more than you do at the end of this book.
Gotcha. So you would almost recommend that they read them back to back?
Yeah, I would say read them together. And I would say if it doesn't help, put it down. Lewis often said if this analogy doesn't help, just forget it.
Yeah.
If you feel that it's only aggravating your grief, we do feel for people we know listening to us. This is not just an intellectual question. This isn't just bouncing ideas around. There are people that feel very bereaved and even isolated from God in their bereavement.
Right. And that is where I would find the comfort from this, that it's okay to get angry at God, where I think some people, some Christians feel so guilty about feeling anger or frustration or doubt. And doubt is okay. And I think this book would have helped me growing up in kind of a fundamentalist background that, oh no, you can't question anything because that shows you're not a real good Christian.
Yeah.
And Lewis's point, of course, as you go through the book is you can't stay in that anger, that it's okay, but now you've got to move beyond it. You've got to think in new ways.
Yeah. Right. I feel like this book would almost be a very good way into C.S. Lewis for maybe someone who is struggling with deconstructing their faith or is questioning their faith in some way. This would be a good starting point, and then to go move on to books like The Problem of Pain or Letters to Malcolm and Mere Christianity and other books, because it gives a voice and you go, oh, this person has had these same thoughts as I have, but he's able to navigate a way out of it for you. But he doesn't get there by the end of this book. That's where, like, Letters to Malcolm and Problem of Pain.
He's admirably honest. It would be easy to fake it. He knows he's a famous Christian writer, and it would be easy to say, well, knowing that this is God's will, and she and I will be reunited and together, and not really feel that, not really mean it, but know that that's what his readers wanted him to say.
Yeah.
So you have to admire his brutal honesty.
Yeah.
And I see this as a culmination of his exploration of sweet desire or Sehnsucht, that these experiences in life are all ultimately directing you towards Creator God, who is the final consummation of us, for us as human beings. And at least twice, he criticizes that view of heaven as, oh, that's the place where we're going to be reunited with our loved ones. And he's saying, once again, that is idolizing the signs of love on earth.
Yeah.
And all those signs are ultimately pointing to the source of all love, the source of all creation, the source of all good, which is God, who is a Trinity, God who is inherently communal.
Yeah. He says, to me, the thing that stood out to me, maybe this is a good place to end, he says, there are two widely different convictions that press more and more on my mind. One is that the eternal vet is even more inexorable and the possible operations even more painful than our severest imaginings can forebode. But the other, that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well.
Yeah, Julian of Norwich.
Yeah.
But she also quoted in Problem of Pain. I love that closing line as well. She smiled, but not at me, and then she turned toward the eternal fountain. This wonderful, glorious image that in the end, we all are going to be looking up toward this eternal light rather than being caught somewhere in a spiral or a staircase.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.